Good morning. Welcome to Coffee with Connie. I'm Connie Foote with Foote Title Group, where we protect your home ownership. How is everybody doing today? And how do you like our new studio? Yep, we're stepping up in the world. Coffee with Connie has its own logo, and soon we're going to have some other things that we're going to show you to help you remember to tune in to find out information about that home buying, home selling process. So thank you so much for taking the time to tune in, and let me know your feedback on the new logo and the new studio. I really appreciate your time. So a lot of times I have scheduled things I want to talk about, just because if I don't get questions, I do have some experiences with things that people have asked me questions about. So I want to bring those things up to share with all of you, because obviously if somebody else has a question about it, I'm sure that you probably do as well. Or maybe it was a question you didn't even think about that is something that you would want to know the answer. And so a lot of times we don't get questions from the audience, and then sometimes we do. So yesterday I got a question from a real estate agent that I do a lot of work with, who asked me specifically about the Maryland first-time home buyer recordation tax credit and how that works and what the requirements are. So I thought I'd talk about it. And, you know, sometimes we talk about things that are generic across the country, that the rules apply across the country. And sometimes we talk about things locally, because Foote Title Group is licensed in Maryland and Virginia, all through those two states, to do closings. So we have the experience in those rules. So the Maryland first-time home buyer credit looks like this. So if you are buying a home in Maryland and it's the first time you've ever owned a home in Maryland, then the state waives 0.25% of one of the recording costs that they charge. That is an actual recording tax that you have to pay at closing. And it's a percentage of the sales price of the property. So it's the sales tax is called state recordation tax, and it is charged at 0.5% of the sales price of the property. So that can be pretty significant. You know, if you're talking about a $200,000 house, you're actually talking about a $1,000 recordation tax. So half of that, if you get that waived, then it makes a big significant difference to you. So let's talk about that. So if you're not a first-time Maryland home buyer, or if you're buying a house in the state of Maryland, the state charges a state recordation tax of 0.5% of the sales price. If you're a first-time Maryland home buyer, that cost is cut in half. They only charge 0.25%. There are a couple of rules. Number one, if you're splitting the recordation tax between the buyer and the seller, the buyer gets the credit, the 25%, or excuse me, the 0.25% at that point is not split between the buyer and the seller. The seller has to pay the remaining 0.25%, and the buyer has no cost whatsoever. That's number one. Number two, you have to be a first-time Maryland home buyer. So let's talk about that for a second, because this is where that question came up. So you're a first-time Maryland home buyer. You've never bought a home in the state of Maryland before, but you have been on the ownership of a piece of property. Let's say, for example, your now spouse, excuse me, your now spouse, at the time that you met, he already owned or she already owned a piece of property. You got married. The spouse wanted you to be on the ownership of that property, obviously for planning purposes, which we talk about a lot, but so the spouse adds you to the ownership of that property. You now own a piece of property in the state of Maryland. Even though you didn't buy it, you own it. So if you own a piece of property in the state of Maryland, you cannot later purchase something and qualify for a first-time Maryland home buyer tax credit, because now you've owned a piece of property. The state of Maryland did that because they want to encourage people to buy homes in the state. And so by doing that, it's people coming from outside of the state into the state to purchase property within the state of Maryland. So just to qualify, it's a savings of 0.25% of the sales price. It is a credit that's given at the closing table, so it's 0.25% less that you have to pay, and you have to be a first-time Maryland homebuyer that has never owned a piece of property in the state ever. And if those are all true, you'll sign a certification at the closing saying that you are a first-time Maryland homebuyer, that you've not ever owned a piece of property in the state, and that document is recorded is presented to the county and is recorded with the documents that your transfer the ownership of the property to you. So it's presented to the clerk's office where the recorders are, so they can make sure that they're calculating the cost correctly. Now, as far as penalties are concerned, I don't establish the penalties. I don't review the penalties. I know that there's a lot of properties that are reviewed. They have audits all the time, and if they find that you said that you were a first-time home buyer and you weren't, then they do have the opportunity to come back and penalize you a cost for that over and above what that tax amount is. I'm not aware of what that penalty is, and so you'd have to talk to the clerk's office about that if that was the case and you had a concern about that. So there's some information for you today. If you didn't know about that first-time home buyer credit, then maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's something that you want to look at if you're thinking about moving into the state of Maryland. Several counties have their own transfer recording tax too, and some of them give credits if you're going to be occupying the property, if it's a first-time home buyer. Depending on those kind of rules, they have some credits as well based on the certifications that you sign that you're going to be occupying the property and it's a first-time home buyer, some of those types of things. But specifically across the state, that first-time home buyer credit is 0.25%, and you can't have ever owned a piece of property in the state of Maryland before. So hopefully that answered a question for you. As this was a question for me, feel free to reach out and ask questions. You don't have to do it online. You don't have to do it in front of everyone else. You can message me through Facebook. You can email me on our website. Any of our team members are very well versed in Maryland and Virginia and can answer all those questions for you. So check out our website and go and ask those questions. Or you can reach out right through this broadcast and ask any questions. So I really appreciate you taking the time to tune in. And if you have questions, reach out and let me know. Thanks so much for tuning in to Coffee with Connie. I'm Connie Foote with Foote Title Group, where we protect your home ownership. Have a fantastic day, guys, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.